This episode of New Politics was released on the 1st of February, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Well, a big welcome to 2025. This is our first episode for the year, and a big welcome to you too, David.
Thanks for having me back, Eddie. It's been a great break, but it's great to be back and getting stuck into the things that we need to get stuck into.
Oh, well, that's right, but also a lot has been happening while we've been away. There's a new president in the United States. There's been a ceasefire in Gaza. There hasn't been a ceasefire in those ongoing culture wars in Australia. We just had another battle on January the 26th, and we'll be discussing all of these issues pretty soon. But it just goes to show that politics is just like rust. It never sleeps, and there'll be a lot more coming up in the lead up to the next federal election, I'd say.
We're heading into, I think, what will be a very busy time for both politicians and the people who analyse and watch them. I think we'll find that the mainstream press will try and keep things in the same lanes that they always keep them in. As always, the interesting stuff is the stuff that we maybe don't notice as much, but is there. And this is stuff that you and I like to concentrate on.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month. Or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Here it is. Here it is. Here it is. Here it is.
We've just started up another round of the Culture Wars, also known as Australia Day or Invasion Day, and the battle, as usual, has been led by that five-star general of the Culture Wars, Peter Dutton. Last year it was a battle over supermarkets not stocking Australia Day thongs, towels and stubby holders. This year it's a battle over people being ashamed to celebrate Australia Day, apparently, and now Peter Dutton says that it's the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who is creating all the division, even though it's Peter Dutton who has been at the forefront of all of this. But David, this happens each and every year. Peter Dutton is just being like an authoritarian leader when he wants to force people to smile and celebrate Australia Day. And then there's this whipped up frenzy from the Conservatives about supposedly respecting a day that just does not deserve this level of respect, in my opinion. And people should be able to do whatever they want on this particular day. Personally, I don't acknowledge Australia Day at all. For me, it's Invasion Day, but that's my choice, and no one is stopping me from saying that or commemorating in that particular day, and it's not stopping anyone else from celebrating Australia Day if that's what they wish to do. But the day after January the 26th, it was almost like here today, gone tomorrow. I don't think people care so much about this day as they used to, and I don't think that's going to stop Peter Dutton from waging this culture war because he pretty much hasn't got anything else to offer. But this process probably isn't going to stop until the next federal election, I'd say.
I think what happens is that people want to have the day off. I think people want to acknowledge the day in some kind of way. For a lot of people, it's a time of acknowledging the good things that has happened for many people who've lived here since 1788. For other people, it's a time of grieving and mourn of the loss for the bad things that have happened. And I think that Australia should be big enough as a country that you can do both. One of the things that we should do is look at changing the date. I think that would just make it a bit easier. We can look at both sides, and I'm trying not to both side the argument. And there are people who fully acknowledge and agree with the arguments that it's Invasion Day, that it's not a good day for our Indigenous population, but still wish to at least acknowledge the positive things that have happened over the last 200 years for the population. And of course, there'll be those of you saying that the two are irreconcilable. It's got to be one or the other, and it should be whichever one they prefer, of course. I think Dutton uses it as a way, and the right use it as a way to cause division, to keep in the paper. It's easy to call Woolworths a woke organisation, as they tried to last year, is like calling the National Party a group of leftists. It's just not. A couple of actions done for commercial reasons. The stuff wasn't selling, so why would they stock it? Does not make you a woke organisation.
Oh, well, I don't even know what this day means anymore. It seems to be a day where the Conservatives are the one who actually look forward to having this big beat up about Western civilization, all this anti-woke stuff. And I just find it so predictable. It's unoriginal. It's the same each and every year, and it just ends up being pretty boring. And David, as you know, we do have free speech in this country, and of course this sort of debate and contention should be allowed, but it's just ramped up out of all proportion by the likes of Peter Dutton for political purposes, and by Sky News. It's this confected outrage and just keeps pushing this white authoritarian view of history, which is exclusive and just not historically correct. That's the other issue that I've got with it as well. And this is what John Howard used to do. This is what Tony Abbott used to do, Scott Morrison. It's just this whitewashing of history. And then we get more conservative stupidity. We had the case of Sussan Ley announcing that the first fleet in 1788 was like Elon Musk's mission to Mars, and that the first fleet didn't actually come out to destroy or to pillage, even though that's exactly what they did. And things like this coming from the Liberal Party, they're not done by accident. These are carefully calibrated messages designed to upset and designed to get the attention, and then it gets picked up and ramped up by the media. Here's the ABC deciding that it's best to ask the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, what he thinks about Sussan Ley's comments.
Sussan Ley has compared the arrival of the first fleet with Elon Musk's efforts to build a colony on Mars. The Prime Minister criticised her. What do you think is wrong with the comparison?
Well, honestly, if I focused my time and energy on crazy stuff that Sussan Ley says, I wouldn't get anything else done. I think the maddest thing that Sussan Ley has said was when she was asked a year ago this month whether the coalition would roll back Labor's tax cuts for every taxpayer. She said that was absolutely their position. And so I can't focus on mad stuff that Sussan Ley says from time to time.
Why do you think it's mad, though?
Well, it's mad because at a time when people are under cost of living pressure, they've got a government, this Labor government under Anthony Albanese, focused on the cost of living and beating inflation. And they've got a coalition led by Peter Dutton focused on conflict and culture wars. And that's what this speech was all about. It was deliberately written to try and provoke a response. I'm not going to take the bait. Sussan Ley says crazy stuff all of the time. I'm focused on the cost of living. They're focused on culture wars. I'll keep doing my job without obsessing over every kind of B-grade speech that Sussan Ley gives.
So all of this gets the attention. It soaks up valuable time by talking about this rubbish and not the other more important issues. And this is what this strategy is all about. Create the outrage and waste everybody's time.
That Sussan Ley spoke in her church, fine. She absolutely has that right. Probably she would see it as part of her responsibilities as a local member, although I don't know that. Well, no, I'll be fair. She might have spoken in the local mosque or synagogue if they'd asked, or temple. I won't go there. But certainly it didn't seem to be a terribly newsworthy speech. And with an embarrassing piece of historical analysis like that, that would have been one that you might have put on your website for a couple of days and quietly taken down. Instead, it gets national coverage and is less quietly taken down because once people realised just what a inept and inapt comparison it was, it didn't last well. So it was clearly Sussan Ley trying to take advantage of a slow news period and try and take up some of the oxygen that might have been taken up by, say, lower inflation figures, a rising jobs rate, things like that. Speculation that the Reserve Bank might cut rates before May. It didn't really work because it wasn't an idea that could sustain much beyond, well, the two completely different things. And also Elon Musk has blotted his copybook and is liked by fewer and fewer people. So if the press wasn't so soft towards the Liberal Party, it wouldn't have got a run at all, except maybe in a derisive and humiliating way for her.
And there was also a different type of outrage, and it wasn't about Woolworths not selling Australia Day T-shirts or thongs or anything like that, but it was about another T-shirt worn by Grace Tame to the Australian of the Year reception at the Lodge in Canberra. And the T-shirt worn by Grace Tame had the words "Fuck Murdoch" on the front of them. And this created more outrage for Sky News and the Australian newspaper. And the Prime Minister didn't say anything at the time, but the day after, this is what he had to say.
It was clearly designed to get attention. I don't intend to add to that attention because I do think that it takes away from what the day should be about, which is the amazing people who were nominated as Australians of the Year.
And of course, this was done to seek attention because the Murdoch empire has got a cancerous influence on not just Australian politics, but politics in Britain and in the United States, and nothing is being done about it. And maybe Anthony Albanese was upset about not getting his own T-shirt to wear around the Lodge, but if his government had implemented a royal commission into the Murdoch empire, as was requested by over 500,000 people through that petition organised by Kevin Rudd a few years ago, well, Grace Tame wouldn't have had to wear the T-shirt and we wouldn't be talking about it today.
I thought it was appalling that she had such an offensive word on the T-shirt. I'd have felt a lot easier if she'd blocked out the U, so it just had M*RDOCH, but she wore what she wore, so that's okay. Look, again, if we live in a country that champions free speech, she had every right to use it. Of course, the free speech warriors only like free speech when it agrees with them. If it doesn't agree with them, then it's got to be suppressed, repressed, put down and shut away. It was hardly surprising that Grace Tame, who you might describe as a provocateur, and I don't mean that in any disparaging way, by the way, others might, I genuinely don't, would wear something like that.
Well, no one else wants to talk about this stuff, so she decided to raise it as an issue.
Exactly. And it is true that the Murdoch, we suffered 9 years of an inept, corrupt, incompetent government featuring such people as Joe Hockey, Scott Morrison, Angus Taylor, because the majority owner of the press in Australia didn't really ever hold them to account, despite what they may argue. Tony Abbott should have lost the prime ministership the minute he ran out of parliament to try and stop a division, or tried to run out of parliament and then was forced to vote, yet went on to become prime minister after he ate the onion. Instead, we had to put up with him for nearly 2 years. Malcolm Turnbull had to deal with a completely feral cabinet because it suited Murdoch. Now, I'll be fair, I'm not sure that Turnbull would have been a great prime minister or even a terribly good one, but his views were more in line with centrist Australia than his predecessor or his successor. And of course, Scott Morrison, the most venal, corrupt prime minister we ever had. And I know that there's probably some of you out there saying, oh, but what about Albo? Yeah, no, not even close. We will be discussing Anthony Albanese later, of course, but compared to Morrison, he's Alfred Deakin or Gough Whitlam or Bob Menzies. And that's not including the lives destroyed through other means. The celebrity lives destroyed. People like in the UK where there's a little bit more freedom to speak up, Steve Coogan and Hugh Grant, let alone Harry and Meghan, who withdrew their case, but only after a massive payment. And there's a legal glitch, which meant that you either took the massive amount of money on offer or you ended up paying more even if you won, which is why some people tried to say, oh, he backed down, but in fact it makes no sense. But they got a written apology and a retraction dating back to 1997, so that while it mightn't have been everything they were after, that was a huge thing. Over here, apart from a few like Grace Tame, we don't get a lot of that level of criticism of the press from people who've been affected. But I'll be fair, Murdoch's tentacles run deep. And if you're trying to make a living as a entertainer or commentator or what have you, annoying the person who owns 80% of the outlets, plus publishing, radio, etc., it's very difficult to speak out. So, again, another reason to say good on you, Grace Tame.
So with all this Australia Day business, I don't know exactly what the best solutions are. This is the outrage that comes out every single year. And I'm pretty sure that if it wasn't about Australia Day, if Australia Day was moved to somewhere else, if it wasn't about Australia Day, Conservatives in the media would just find something else to be outraged about. And David, you suggested moving the date of Australia Day to a different date, but historically, Australia did not exist on the 26th of January in 1788. That illegal annexation was known as New South Wales, and before that, this landmass was understood by Europeans to be New Holland. And the idea of Terra Australis for Europeans, well, it also included the landmass of what is now known as Antarctica. And the word Australia didn't become official until 1824, and it didn't exist as a country until January the 1st, 1901, when it was federated. And David, you and I are creative people. We're always looking for creative solutions. So perhaps we could have Australia Day on January the 1st every year, which is technically, legally and historically correct. And if people are worried about missing out on that holiday towards the end of January, well, have the last Monday of January as the public holiday, and you can call it whatever you want on that day. So I think that might be a meaningful solution for everyone.
A few people have pointed out that January 26 has had other significances. The Australian citizenship law of 46 was passed on the 26th of January, meaning that Australians could actually identify as Australians and not just citizens of the British Commonwealth. It became a political and national identity, not just a geographical one. The other one, there was a lovely meme going around, which kind of got it wrong a little bit. But the Rum Rebellion in New South Wales started on the 26th of January in 1810, which led to the brief overthrow of the Bligh governorship and New South Wales being run by shady corporates who were in it for money. Now, you might argue that, in fact, that was a very successful coup that is still happening. But nonetheless, it was one of those things that Australians like to think happen, the plucky young locals overthrowing a corrupt system. Not quite, but we could celebrate that. Still very New South Wales centric, of course. I think May the 1st is a good day. I think January 1st makes the most sense because the Federation of Australia doesn't actually have any connotations. I've got to be careful saying this because it doesn't improve things for Indigenous people, but at least it wasn't further abrogation of Indigenous rights and privileges and all of the things that Indigenous people should have. So, yeah, and then I'm sure we can find something at the end of January. Unfortunately, Elvis Presley's birthday is the 8th of January, so it's maybe a bit soon. Well, that might get people to work a bit quicker and you don't get this dead Sydney and Melbourne month from Christmas Eve to Australia Day. We go Christmas Eve to January 8th.
Well, there are solutions out there if only people start looking for them.
Yeah, but for some reason, I know Andrew Bolt tried to go viral with his claim that it should be October 19, the day we voted no to The Voice. And that died, as it should have, being offensive, racist, and just a stupid idea, and didn't go anywhere. I think there's a date in which we have the celebratory day on 1st of January, and then Sorry Day or some such on the 26th, where it's a day of reflection and mourning like Anzac Day should be.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
I could have been sunbathing on the beach. You have never seen a body so beautiful. Much better than Sleepy Joe.
Now, usual warning to audience members who are triggered by a certain president of the United States. We'll be talking about this guy for the next 15 minutes or so you can look away or point your ears in a different direction for a little while. But Donald Trump is the president of the United States, and this is his second term, and saying this in 2025 is as bizarre as when we first said it back in 2016. 1917. And if people think that Sussan Ley's comments about the First Fleet and the visit to Mars was bad enough, well, that's nothing compared to Trump's first week in office, where he threatened to take over the Panama Canal, demanded to take Greenland from Denmark, and if they didn't, he'd consider that to be an act of hostility, and officially changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico, which is the way that it's been known since 1550, to the Gulf of America. And this was just the first week. But this whole process will continue for the next 207 weeks that he's going to be in office. And all of this really is a smokescreen for what's really going on. The United States cannot take the Panama Canal. It's on Panamanian soil. And although there was a treaty for the Panama Canal Zone where the US had control of the canal up until 1977, that was a negotiated agreement. And what Trump is proposing would be an act of war. And the same with Greenland. That's been a part of Denmark since 1814, and they've had self-government since 1979. But this is all part of the mayhem, as was Elon Musk's Nazi salute.
You know, there are elections that come and go. Some elections are, important, some are not. But this one, this one really mattered. And I just want to say thank you for making it happen. Thank you. My heart goes out to you. It is thanks to you that the future of civilization is assured.
These are all distractions. And in the background, Trump has appointed some pretty corrupt people into government. He started to wind back women's rights. He's winding back LGBTQI rights. He's removing diversity. He's promoted the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And all of this is taking place at the moment while everyone else is busy with all these questions about, can Trump really take Greenland and Panama Canal? Can he really do all of this, or can he not do this? Is Elon Musk really a Nazi, or is he a Mussolini supporter, or is it just a Roman salute? What's going on there? These are all classic smokescreens, and it's going to be mayhem. This has only been the first week, but it's going to be mayhem, corruption, and incompetence on a grand scale, just as it was in the first term.
And worse, I think, because in the first term, they didn't quite know what they were doing. The second term, they know what they're doing, and they've got a bit more control in the House. What's going to thwart him is state power. He's already lost some court cases in key states based on who's allowed to live there, for example. The Supreme Court's on his side, but it will be very difficult for the Supreme Court to uphold some of the unconstitutional things that he has done. The birthright citizenship thing, for example, completely trying to take off citizenship of people who were born here. Born in the United States. I've been watching and reading a lot on it, so the language has infused me. I do apologise, dear listener. Who were born in the United States, even if their parents weren't. And of course, nobody can really control where they're born. And if your parents went over as undocumented people and you were born there, you're in the States. And that's true if your parents were there on holidays for 6 weeks. Why you'd book a holiday 6 weeks before you were having a baby, I don't know, but it happens. Or if you were born on an American ship. For example, your parents may be full German citizens. Germany has a slightly different citizenship. If your parents are German, then you're German. It's a bit like the British one. It's not about where you were born. It's about who your parents were. Britain's the same. Australia, I think, is the same. For America to change that would be to overturn a whole lot of precedents that will be very problematic for it to maintain. And while we're looking at people who weren't there fully legally, Elon Musk was an illegal immigrant. Melania Trump was really an illegal immigrant brought over. And so it's one of those things that as they go through into churches and schools and workplaces, places where you'd expect to be safe, and take people. He's talking about enclosing them all on Guantanamo Bay, where they'll be concentrated in one area. Now, hold a second. Where have I heard this before?
It's okay. You can say it. We've heard it all before back in Nazi Germany.
Pretty much. I was going to say back in South Africa with the British and the Boers, but same thing. They're looking at concentration camp. Whether that will lead to the outcome of the German concentration camps remains to be seen, but it's not a good look.
And for me, United States politics is a bit of a joke, even when the Democrats are in office. And I think it will be more of a joke over the next 4 years, but it's not a joke for the rest of the world. The US is still the most powerful and most influential country in the world. Now, it might not be for too much longer with the rise of China, but my feeling is that it's going to become a lot more extreme, the entire country. And Trump has changed the process of modern politics. That idea of the idiot king, the noise and the mayhem and the outright idiocy, that all seems to get the rewards in modern day politics. And of course, we've seen all of this before. We saw it with Mussolini in Italy. We saw it with Hitler in Germany. We've seen it in quite a few countries, well, throughout history, all across the world. And it's always a big show that has disastrous consequences for not just the country, but for the entire world. And I think we also have to think about what all of this means for Australia and for that alliance with the United States. And I think it gives us an opportunity to start forging creative alliances elsewhere. And that doesn't mean giving up on the United States, but over the next 20 years or so, I think stronger alliances and relationships have to be formed with other countries, with China, with Indonesia, with India, reassessing the AUKUS arrangement, which is purely in the interests of the United States and Britain. It's definitely not in Australia's interests. And I think if Australia did have a stronger and better alliance with China, I'm not saying that it's terrible at the moment, it has been patched up by the Albanese government, and China is already Australia's biggest trading partner by far. If you had a much stronger and better alliance with China, well, you wouldn't need to buy all of those nuclear submarines under the AUKUS agreement, which we're probably not going to get anyway.
No, exactly. I mean, they've already admitted there's no submarines coming, not even in 30 years.
I think there's a couple of tanks coming our way and a few little boats.
Oh, thank goodness. That'll keep them out. 3 tanks and 2 boats. And again, we've had trade dealings with Indonesia for 150 years, probably more if you include indigenous trade with Indonesia. Papua New Guinea is closer to the Australian mainland than Tasmania is, and that's important to remember. It's a quick hop on a canoe, a couple of hours on the canoe, and you're really on what is now modern Indonesia, or parts of it, Irian Jaya and things like that. But since white settlement, we've traded with China, Japan, and now Korea, Indonesia, Cambodia, and happily. And the Keating idea that the Far East to them is the near north to us remains very true, and having good relationships. And they won't always be harmonious relationships. We clash with New Zealand all the time, which is culturally not identical, but very close to Australia. Doesn't mean we're going to war with them, doesn't mean that we're not going to stop trading with New Zealand. It doesn't mean that New Zealand stops being an extremely important neighbour and ally and friend. It just means that countries have to look after their own self-interest. And it's the same if we were able to do that with India. I didn't quite dig into it because I'm not a sports watcher, but there was some talk about the number of Indian people at the cricket in Melbourne and how many of them were local. And this is great. I mean, if you want people, it doesn't matter what background you have. If you're buying a ticket, surely the cricket people would be happy, and I'm sure the cricket people were happy that they got sold out tickets. But there was a little bit of, why are there so many Indians here, in that subtext way that the mainstream press can do. But very important country to Australian multiculturalism and Australian culture, as is China. We've had Chinese immigration here since at least 1830. There are families who are of Chinese descent who have been here for longer than a lot of people of Anglo descent. The big Celtic wave only happens in the famine with the gold rushes and things in the 1850s. That's when a lot of Chinese immigrants come out too. And so we have that. We've had very good relations with Japan since the 1950s, with the cars, with the televisions, with all the other stuff we bought from Japan, which we're now buying really from China and Indonesia. To try and prop up a very Western-centric or very Euro-centric, and I'm using European very broadly here, meaning also the United States, seems to me to be a bit short-sighted. Not to say, as you rightly said, we don't have to get rid of them and they don't stop being important to us. But Australian national interest has to move away from being essentially the lapdog and being a firm, strong member of the international community who is as friends to as many people as it's possible to be friends with.
Young man, there's no need to feel down. I said, young man, pick yourself off the ground. I said, young man.
And we can also see that the Liberal Party is now pretty much copying what the Trump administration is doing, even though the ABC published an article during the week claiming that Peter Dutton isn't going to use the Trump playbook in the lead up to the next federal election. Now, I'm not sure where the ABC has been over the past year, but that's exactly what Peter Dutton has been doing. He hasn't been dancing along to the Village People, but pretty much everything else he's been doing is straight from the Trump playbook. And
you'll have to excuse me, Eddie. I've got to get some bleach to wipe that image out of my eyes.
I'll pass it over to you. And during the week, Peter Dutton announced Jacinta Price as the spokesperson for government efficiency. And that's an exact replica of Trump's Department of Government Efficiency. Well, it's using exactly the same words. And I think Jacinta Price might need to look at her own wasteful expenditure if she wants to be serious about this. She spent $76,000 on business class flights during the Voice to Parliament referendum in 2003, spent $21,000 on a flight to attend a cost of living committee meeting. She could also look at Peter Dutton's $23,000 flight to a Gina Reinhardt conference, or when he spent $63,000 for himself and his staff members to fly to another cost of living meeting. There was also $6,000 to attend another Gina Reinhardt party. And then when Jacinta Price has finished up there, she could actually have a look at all the wasteful rorts, car park rorts and corruption instigated by the Liberal Party when they were in office. So there might actually be quite a lot of work for her to do here. But I just thought that the world had had enough of this Trumpist behaviour. I thought that we had enough of the first term of Donald Trump, Boris Johnson in the UK, Scott Morrison here, and I thought that this might just be the end of it all. But it's also partially in response to their replacements just being so underwhelming. Joe Biden in the United States and his follow-up, Kamala Harris, Keir Starmer in the UK, Anthony Albanese here. And I don't think that they've been bad leaders, and they've just done what they had to do as far as the work of government is concerned, but they've just been so poor politically. And it's almost like they've created a pathway for these nut jobs to return to office. And I'm just wondering, well, what can centre-ish parties do? And I'm not going to call them left or centre because they're just not. But all of these convenient idiots like Trump, Boris Johnson, Scott Morrison, they always present themselves as outsiders. But they're not. They're all on the right, and they're a solid part of establishment as well. And they just open up the gates for billionaires and corrupt business people to get into government. I don't mean as members of government, but to actually influence and have strong roles within government itself. And the left, or whatever you want to call them, I just don't think that they've worked out a way of dealing with all of this. Anthony Albanese promised change, but it's been a slow, incremental change. You know, as far as I'm concerned, they've actually been good government, but the politics has just been absolutely hopeless. And Peter Dutton is just this mindless populist and just says whatever he needs to say. He's modelling himself exactly on Donald Trump, except for the Village People, of course. But this is what seems to work in modern day politics, and the right and the extreme right is just winning out on this level.
The left made a crucial mistake, I think, and this goes back to Tony Blair and Clinton, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating. We can point to the many, many good things that those men did, but they took it as read that the economy couldn't be reformed to a fairer way than neoliberalism, which is one of the most unfair ways. And we have people like Jim Chalmers who speak eloquently and deeply on economic reform, but are prevented from really doing the major economic reform that is needed to get us out of this neoliberal con. And it is a con. Private health insurance, what's that? It provides nothing, it does nothing. It just shuffles money from the patient to the health provider without actually providing any value. Private education in Australia, it's the same curriculum, it's the same pool of teachers, it's the same as anywhere else. It provides nothing of any value, certainly not with some of the elite schools anyway, the massive fees involved. Private law enforcement, it's just something that I can't even begin to. And even down to private media seems to be failing. If it's run fairly and does a good job, okay, do it. But private mainstream media, where the ABC is cowed by what's happening outside it. Its editors and journalists don't want to close off their options for jobs outside the industry or outside the ABC. Private infrastructure. Why did the government pay far more for a private firm to build the road so they can then profit than just build the road themselves? The left has to really take a stand. I think centrism has died. It stood for nothing, so fell for everything, and has fallen.
Oh, and my point is also that even if the left or centre-left, whatever you want to call them, if they were doing all of those good things that were opposed to neoliberalism, they probably wouldn't get much credit for it. And
they wouldn't.
It's the populists that are winning out because they do all of these populist, mad, crazy things like dancing to the village people. And Jim Chalmers is actually a fan of the Beastie Boys. Maybe he should start dancing along to the Beastie Boys when he starts doing his press conferences, or maybe Anthony Albanese should put on some Midnight Oil or Radio Birdman or something like that. Just do something different to jazz it up a little bit.
Fight for your right to cut interest rates.
Well, whatever the case is, I'm being a little bit facetious, but I'm just trying to work out, well, why are the populists and their right wing and their extremist right wing, why are they winning out on these sort of battles when they've absolutely got nothing to offer and they do the opposite of good government?
Yeah, there's a timidity in the left. And instead of standing up like the great leftist reformers did, and let's be fair, the great rightist reformers stood up. Margaret Thatcher was a terrible PM, but you knew pretty much where she stood. John Howard was a terrible PM, but you knew pretty much exactly where he stood. We need our leftist leaders to stand up and show us where they are. And if it means that they lose votes, then they lose votes. It's better to die for something than to fall for anything. And it's, Peter Garrett. It's better to die on your feet than live on your knees. I know he didn't say that originally, but while we're quoting songs, the vested interests have to be cleared out of Parliament. I think we should go back to publicly funded elections with a cap on spending. You get so much. Everybody gets approximately the same amount. You're not allowed to take private donations. It's harder to do this, but you get rid of somehow, and this is where I'll have to hand it over to our listeners with ideas. You have to get rid of those lobbyists who damage. I'm actually all for lobbyists, believe it or not, in that I have something that I believe is right and I go in and lobby my local member, the minister, the parliament, whomever. I have no problem with that in principle.
Well, ACOS is a lobbyist.
Yeah, exactly. When people say, we've got to get rid of lobbyists, I don't know that I want to get rid of ACOS. I don't want to get rid of the various housing lobbies and disabled people's lobbies. But we have to get rid of money as a political tool. Ban private donations. And people say, can't we cap them? But what happens is that we cap them at, say, $100 a year, and then suddenly you get $3 million $100 donations from
two people. Well, indirectly from two people, but that's...
Indirectly from two people. We have to think about how to fix this. Having compulsory voting is great, although they still try it here. The apathy, both parties are the same. What's the point? I live in a safe seat. What's the point? I live in a swinging seat, but it'll go to the person I don't want to vote to. What's the point? But it does tend to take the edge off that a bit. In Britain, of course, the Conservative bus used to take all the Labor voters down, and the Labor bus used to take all the Conservative voters down, just because the other side wanted to use the resources of the other side. But we don't need any of that. Australia has a really great voting model. Yes, as we've said in our book, it needs some reform, but the bones are there to make it one of the leading democracies in the world, yet there's no will to do this. Of course, a lot of these reforms will probably see the party who bring them in kicked out. But again, it's better to go on making principled changes than to hang around for years and do nothing.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
There's been a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, and it's already been running for about 2 weeks, despite Israel continuing to kill people within Palestine and southern Lebanon. The ceasefire is still holding, and there will be 3 stages to the ceasefire. The first stage was to allow for a hostage exchange, and we have to remember that Israel has been keeping Palestinian hostages for many, many years. The other part is that the Israeli Defence Forces will leave Palestinian cities and the larger towns. There will be an influx of aid and a return of displaced Palestinians, which is what's been happening over the past couple of days. Stage 2 commences next week, and there'll be more hostage exchanges, Israel to make a complete withdrawal from Gaza and a permanent ceasefire. And then stage 3 will see the return of bodies of hostages who have died, and the reconstruction of Gaza will commence, which will probably take decades to complete. Now, the state of Israel hasn't achieved any of its objectives. It's killed at least 45,000 Palestinians, possibly up to 200,000. It's accepted a ceasefire deal that was actually on offer in May 2024, and it rejected it at the time. The government of Benjamin Netanyahu has corroded so much that it's almost on the verge of collapse. The war has cost Israel billions and billions of dollars, and its economy is also on the verge of collapse. Now, Netanyahu specifically said that the aim was to wipe out Hamas, and Hamas is still there, and it's probably even stronger than it was before Israel started this war. The war has been a complete waste of time, like most wars are, and in my opinion, Israel has lost this process, even though it inflicted most of the pain on Palestine through death and destruction and wiping out about 80% of all the infrastructure, schools and hospitals.
It's been so upsetting. As bad as that October 7 attack was, and it didn't justify what has happened. The only Hamas leader they've caught was the person they had in charge of negotiating the peace deal. They killed him. They've finally negotiated a peace, and I think that's because most of the world has realised just how bad the Israeli government is, and Netanyahu realised that something had to be done. The ceasefire is a good thing. It should have happened months ago, and ideally we shouldn't have needed a ceasefire. But we're dealing with quite untrustworthy people, and anything can happen. I don't think we're on the road to a lasting peace in Gaza just yet.
Oh, well, that's right, but a ceasefire always has to be welcomed. Anything that stops people from dying, well, of course that has to be welcomed, but it's never going to be a permanent ceasefire unless there is a just resolution, and there's nothing that suggests that that's going to be the case. And, you know, I'm just left wondering how that would ever arise. The United States president has proposed shifting Palestinians to Jordan and Egypt, and guess what? That's exactly what happened in 1946 with the Nakba. It's also known as ethnic cleansing, and President Trump should know that that is a bad thing, but he doesn't. And a better solution, as far as I'm concerned, would be to clear out the Israeli settlers from West Bank and for Israel to completely remove itself from Gaza and the West Bank, and then start looking at southern Lebanon, Golan Heights, and a lot of the other areas. And this will still take many years to resolve, if it ever does happen. And maybe if we see a collapse of the Netanyahu government, or for Benjamin Netanyahu to be removed from Israel politics, that might be a start, although there's probably always going to be another right-wing extremist available to replace Benjamin Netanyahu. But I just think that Israeli society needs to fundamentally change as well as the unchallenged support for the state of Israel among Western leaders. But I just feel that we might be waiting for a long time before that happens.
We've got quite a lot of factors, not least the fact that the Netanyahu and a lot of his cabinet are doing their very best to stay out of jail. While they're in power, it's harder to put them into jail. You've got all that oil and gas in the bay, and that's really what this is all about, getting access to that. In a sense, it's just 1919 all over again, and Lawrence of Arabia and all of that. Bigger powers going in. And you've got the 3 or 4. You've got America. I think you still have British interests trying to hold on as best as they can. Now they don't have the EU. You've got Russia trying to get hold of this stuff. So Putin, who is a serial disruptor, is doing his best as well. And I think one of the figures that we have to keep a closer eye on is Vladimir Putin. Access to those resources is a huge thing. Also, it's a good central spot to have a safe space for your military to be based. And so the United States, I think, would love to have a couple of bases in Palestine near the bay there, just so they can get to places a bit more quickly than they can. I don't think that's a good idea, but I think that's what they're after.
And that's what's happening geopolitically within the area. And a lot of people still ask us, well, what's all of this got to do with Australia? And it's actually got a lot to do with Australia, not directly, but indirectly. And locally, Israel politics plays out in so many different ways. Peter Dutton has just continued his attacks from last year. And as we've mentioned quite a few times before, he's always looking for an opportunity to create division. And this just gives him another opportunity. Now, he's claiming that the government has done very little to stop anti-Semitism in Australia without suggesting what else they could do that's any different to what they're doing at the moment. He said that Foreign Minister Senator Penny Wong shouldn't have gone to the Auschwitz Memorial to commemorate 80 years since the end of the Holocaust. He made a big deal about that. And this all feeds into right-wing Zionist sentiments in Australia. And it's not just Peter Dutton who's been politicising anti-Semitism, it's the Zionist lobby in Australia who, in my opinion, have got far too much influence in this country, and they've been attacking anyone who disagrees with them, including other members of the Jewish community. They've attacked the journalist Anthony Lowenstein, calling him a self-loathing Jew. They've attacked the CEO of the Moderate Jewish Council of Australia, Sarah Schwartz. And then the attacks are all continued by Sky News. Here's Sarah Schwartz responding to Peter Dutton and News Corporation and their politicisation of anti-Semitism.
So I gave a speech at an anti-racism conference, and my speech was about how Peter Dutton and the coalition and far-right actors around the world are exploiting the Jewish community and the rise in anti-Semitism to fuel division and hatred towards other racialised groups. And I think that this incident speaks exactly to why that message is so important. Already we have seen Peter Dutton, throw point fingers at Anthony Albanese, suggest security measures when we have absolutely no knowledge about the ideological motives of what is happening here. So I think the Murdoch press and the coalition have a very big incentive to exploit, what I said in my speech. But the fact that they have chosen this week, rather than actually addressing a rise in anti-Semitism, to go after me for making a point that they are using the Jewish community as political footballs, I think speaks volumes to the way that these people treat Jews and anti-Semitism. And, they really have not shown that they have an interest in actually addressing these really real rises in anti-Semitism. And they are confecting outrage, and that is making Jewish people more scared. And they need to get real and actually stop using our community as political footballs.
I think that these are the people who have done their best to whip up the anti-Semitism in Australia, the Zionist lobby and Peter Dutton. And that does not condone at all any of the fire bombing attacks or Nazi graffiti that's occurred in the eastern suburbs of Sydney or parts of Melbourne, even though there have been suggestions from the Australian Federal Police that there are foreign entities and foreign actors involved here, and who knows, that might even include Mossad. But if they all just shut up and stop politicising Israel and Gaza for their own base purposes, a lot of this might not be actually happening.
You're right. The criticism that the Labor government isn't pro-Israel enough. Again, what is in Australia's national interest? Surely supporting its own citizens. Surely keeping out of another Middle Eastern conflict that has very little effect on us, except militarily, because we get involved for no reason. It's been happening since Gallipoli, and it never ends well. I've noticed that the anti-Semitic attacks, the New South Wales police have come out and said one of them seems to have been a setup, that it wasn't quite what it seemed, that there was too much suspicious behaviour around it to suggest that it was a genuine attack against Jewish people, which should be condemned, by the way. People attacking Jewish people should be condemned. People attacking Middle Eastern people should be condemned. People attacking Asians should be condemned. People attacking Anglos should be condemned, etc., etc., etc. It seems to be the actions of a group who have way overplayed their hand, have lost control, and are trying to fix things by doubling down. Penny Wong, whose public words have been in favour of Israel defending itself, copyright, trademark, has been called a very unenthusiastic supporter of Israel. Well, one, she's the Australian Foreign Minister, so that's got nothing to do with anything, whether she supports Israel or doesn't support Israel, provided, of course, she's not anti-Jewish in this. You can love a country and not support its government. I'm looking at United States. I'm looking at you, Australia, under the Liberal Party. The language used to try and normalise abhorrent behaviour. She didn't support the genocide. She made some mild words of rebuke against us. She must be anti-Semitic, despite all evidence to the contrary. Jeremy Corbyn, who had stood up all his career against anti-Semitism, was claimed to be anti-Semitic. The Labor Party finally admitted that they made that up so he wouldn't be leader of the Labor Party, and that has cost them very dearly. One, it led us to Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, and two, Labor is now floundering in office because it can't really differentiate itself from the Conservative Party.
Well, it's also the situation of, well, what is the Labor government meant to do in this situation? And we've been critical of the Prime Minister for his almost 100% support for the State of Israel and almost total indifference to the plight of Palestinians. But I think the biggest problem for him with all of this is political. Now, setting aside the morality of being totally indifferent to the clear and obvious attempts of genocide in Gaza, and that, I know that that's a hard one to ignore, but we'll just set that aside for the time being. But just politically, Anthony Albanese is in nowhere land on this issue. And I think that the lesson in Australia is that unless a political leader is 200% behind Israel, they will suffer politically. And because Albanese has only been 99.9% in his support of the State of Israel, he's suffered politically. You know, that 0.1% where he hasn't supported the State of Israel, well, that's opened up this avenue for the Zionist lobby and Peter Dutton to attack him politically. And because of this, he doesn't look strong. He's been made to look weak. This week, he's announced 2 Holocaust education centres in Perth and Canberra. Now, before I get accused of anti-Semitism, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but where's the education centres about Islamophobia in Australia, or a museum about the history of the Nakba from 1946? Well, there isn't one in Australia. And because there is now a ceasefire in place in Gaza, and if this continues, well, it might be less of an issue by the time of the next federal election in Australia. But even if the issue itself isn't a factor at the next election, and to be honest, it probably won't be at all, and also the people who have decided that they're not going to vote for the Labor Party at the next election because of their position on Gaza, well, I don't think they're likely to preference the Liberal Party above the Labor Party about this, unless they do it as a protest vote. But I think all of this is more about how managing this issue is reflected in the leadership of the Prime Minister. And if the electorate senses weakness in a leader, and if they don't know anything at all about the issue that they're being weak in, I think that that spills over to other areas. And the electorate might be thinking, well, if they're weak on that issue, what else are they being weak on? And I suppose that generally the electorate does focus on the matters related to the economy when it comes to election time. But I'd say that Anthony Albanese will just be hoping that the issue of Gaza just goes away for the next 5 or 6 months, and that the issue doesn't crop up during the election to remind people of that weakness.
People will notice weakness and lack before they notice positive stuff. And I'm sure many of you have had that experience. You know, you've done a really great job on something, and someone will walk in and say, oh, you missed a bit, for example. And you can magnify that in government because you have approximately half the population against what you're doing anyway. And then on your side, there'll be people who don't think you've gone far enough or done enough or wouldn't have done it that way. It's easy to criticise, hard to do. That's why we're in the criticising business. Doing nothing will cost you far more politically than standing up. I said this earlier, but again, it's absolutely true. You will at least get the acknowledgement of your enemies that you tried to do something, and you might even swing a few of the waivers, and your supporters will find it hard to find that stuff to criticise. Being timid in the face of bullying is never a good look. especially if you're the leader of, the 12th biggest economy in the world and trying to be a regional superpower, to be cowed by vested interests, to be suppressed by vested interests doesn't bode well politically. And the preference flows will swing towards Labor. But it only takes a handful of seats for where you don't get enough of a preference flow and it goes to strong independents or Greens and you're out of government. Now, again, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, but if I was in government and some of the stuff they've started to do is starting to coalesce into something good and coalesce into long-term positive reform, I'd want to be trying to hold on to government so that the next term, in which it seems they planned a lot for, isn't bogged down by endless negotiations by recalcitrant independents or opposition parties.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.